Today's daf is daf Tzadi Aleph, and we'll begin with the Gemara. Yesterday we did the Mishnah, and we learned in the Mishnah that if they promise a prisoner that he will go free before Pesach, we're not going to check the Pesach on his behalf alone if he's the only member of the Chabura, but if there's somebody else who definitely is Chayav, we're not going to rely on the promise that he'll get out of jail. Omar Rabbi Barafun, Omar Rabbi Yochanan, Loshan, and when do we learn this din? That the promise is not to be relied upon, and we won't check the bifnei atzma. Ella, that's only the beis asum di akum. If it's a non-Jewish jail, they won't be relied upon to fulfill that promise that he'll go free. Aval, in the case of beis asum di Israel, if it's a Jewish court and a Jewish prison, and they've determined and guaranteed that he will be free in time for the Pesach, shotim bifnei atzma. Even if he's the only one on whose behalf we're checking the Korban Pesach, we don't have to be worried that at the end he won't be able to get out on time. And the reason for that is kevan daftachinu mapikle. They will certainly release him because they've promised it. And that's a Jewish prison because we don't suspect him of lying. The Tziv, as the pasuk says in Tzfanya, Sheris Yisrael lo yasu avla v'lo yidabru chazav. Bal Yisrael will not speak words of falsehood. And Tosfos Dibra Maskal Lo, here the second Tosfos, he quotes a Yerushalmi that formulates this din in just the opposite way, the same law, but in a different presentation. That in a Beis Asurim Shel Yisrael, we're going to shecht the Korban Pesach on his behalf when he's promised to go free, but only if there's someone else. In the case of Beis Asurim Shel Akum, even if there's someone else besides him, we will not shech the Korban Pesach. We will not rely at all on the promise of the Goyev because of the pasuk in Tilma Sharpiyim Di Bershav, and therefore when you shech the Korban Pesach on his behalf, it's shaloli ochla. Amar Chizda Hadi Amar, that which you said the Beis Hasum the Akum. We don't check the Korban Pesach on his behalf unless there's someone else with him. In the Chabur Law, Amar, we only say that Ella Chutz Lechomas Beis Pagi. If this prison is outside the outer boundaries of Yerushalayim, and therefore, since he's outside of the walls that surround Yerushalayim, he's not allowed to eat the Korban Pesach there in the jail. If he's within the confines of Yerushalayim, that means he's allowed to eat the Korban Pesach there in that jail. We can check it on his behalf. My time, why? Even if in the worst case scenario he doesn't get free before Pesach, if there's a possibility of bringing him the Korban Pesach so that he eat it in jail, he's within the Yerushalayim area, he's within Beis Pagi. Therefore, Lifnimi Chomas Beis Pagi, we can check the Korban Pesach on his behalf. The Mishnah continues and says, Lefichach Era Bahem Sul, if we find that any of the above listed in the Mishnah were apostle, then they are exempt from Pesach Sheni. With the one exception, the Mishnah says, is Mefakeach Begal. If there's debris and he was involved in the rescue trip, the rescue efforts, then he's Chayav in Pesach Sheni. We assume he was Tameh because he was Ma'il al Ames from the beginning of the process of shechting the Korban Pesach. Amar Rabbi Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. We have to differentiate between two cases of Mefakeach al Agal. Lo Shanu, when do we say that if we find a corpse that was buried under debris, then certainly this person who was involved in the rescue effort was Ma'il al Ames, and therefore he contracted Tumah, and therefore we have to send him off to Pesach Sheni. That's only El Agal Agol. If we're talking about a round kind of a debris, in other words, the opening in the ground where everything fell through is round, And Nimtza, he says that we'll know for sure that B'Shosha Helal Agag, when he put himself into this area, it's a very tight area, in order to be Mafana, in order to take out whatever he might find, then for sure he was Mile Alames. Volgal Arok. But if it's a long opening, then there's no guarantee that he was Mile Alames. And therefore, we would assume that he's not Tomei. And he was Yotzei, the Korban Pesach that was brought in his behalf. He's Potami Lasos, Pesach Sheni. Why? Because Ema de Tahar. We're going to assume that B'Shas Shchita, he was Tahar. And here, I would like to read to you a note here in the English translation. And he says the following, that in the case of a round pile, in other words, when he clears out a pile that's round, we'd assume he stood over it in its entirety. And therefore he came in contact with the Tumah, and he was tummy at the time of the Shechita Pesach. In the case of an elongated pile, which one not need clear from above, he's exempt from making the Pesach Sheni, because it's not necessarily so that he stood over the entire pile at once. And we could suggest that he was not contaminated at the time of the Shechita Pesach. Now here, we have a very important note in the Masifta, and he says the following, that according to the Rashash, it doesn't matter one iota where the gal is this pile that he's clearing out, whether it's in Rosh Hashanah or Rosh Hashanah. And we're not going to say that Safek Tum Rosh Hashanah is Smeko Tome, that he's Vade Tome, as we usually do in Safek Tum Rosh Hashanah. Because at the moment that he went down or climbed up on this pile in this gal, there was no one in the world who knew for sure whether or not there was a corpse underneath the pile, at the bottom of the pile. And that generates what's called the Tumas Tahom, which is a Tumah about which no one in the world knew about. And we don't apply the principle of Safek Tum Yochid Svekotami in the case of Tumas Tahom. And we've discussed this in the past. Let's add another comment here, that even though we still end up with a Safek, we're not going to allow him to bring a Pesach Sheni, because that would be what's called a Safek Chulin Lazar, on the side that he was Yotzei with the first Pesach, he wasn't Tameh, then he's bringing Chulin Lazar. Tanya Nami Hachi, we have a brayso that supports this. Reb Shimon Beno Shel, Reb Yochanan Brok Omer, Mefakech Hagal. In the case of Mefakech Hagal, we found the corpse afterwards in the Gal. Itim, in some cases, Potter. He's exempt from Pesach Sheni. And we assume that he was Yotzei with Pesach Rishon. He was not Tameh. And Itim, in other scenarios, Chayav. We assume he was Tameh, and therefore he has to bring Pesach Sheni. Ketzad? Gala gold v'nimtzeis tum'ah tachtav. If it's this round kind of a pile, which we said was Mechuba Mishnei Tzadov, Rosh Mechudad, Ein Shetach Chalat Berosho, Nimtza Shebeshosha Ol Al Gag. When he went on to the Gag, Vadai Hehil Al Hames Tachtov, and then he's Chayav in Pesach Sheni. However, Aroch, Gal Aroch, the Nimtzeis Tuma Tachtov, so we have a Safek. In such a case, Potter, we cannot allow him to bring the Pesach Sheni, because perhaps Tar Hayav B'Shas HaShchita. Now we get up to the Mishnah here on Daf Tzadi Aleph Amud Aleph. Ein shochatim es haPesach al Yochid. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda has a unique shita. The Gemara is going to derive this from Psukim, that one person is not enough to warrant the shchita of a korban pesach. Rabbi Yossi Matir, Rabbi Yossi says you can check it on a Yochid. In fact, the number of people on whose behalf you're shechting is totally irrelevant in both directions. You can have a minui of one person, and you can shech the korban pesach on behalf of that one person, if he could eat a kazayas. But if it's rabim, even if you have 100 people who are part of the chabura, it's not necessarily so that you can check the korban pesach. Afilu chabura shel mea she'enam yicholim lechol kazayas ein shochatin aleim. If they won't be able to eat a kazayas, then we cannot shech the korban pesach on their behalf. Ein yicholim lechol kazayas mea pesach bein kulam. Rashi seems to interpret that even if we gather together all these 100 people and they won't be able to eat a kazayas amongst them, meaning some total of all the people. Now, if on the other hand, Rashi says they would be able to eat a kazayas amongst them, then we would shech the korban pesach on their behalf. The Rambam seems to assume in Hilchos Korban Pesach Perek Beis that kol shein kol echad v'echad mem yochel lechol kazayas ein shoktin alei. We will not shech the pesach for this chabura of 100 people unless we can guarantee that each one of the 100 will be able to eat a kazayas. It's not enough that all told, when we gather together the tziruf of all 100, will be able to have a kazayas. The Gemara says that there's a machlokes in the Brisa about the sauce and how to interpret the pasuk. This is going to be a machlokes of Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi. Can we shech the korban pesach on behalf of one individual? Tana Rabbanan. And the Brisa begins with Rabbi Yehuda. The pasuk in Dvarim, Perek Zayin, has an extra word in it. It says, Lo tzukal lizboach pesach biachad she'arecha. Now, the simple meaning of the pasuk is that we're talking about shechting the korban pesach somewhere on the face of the map in Israel, but not within Yerushalayim. But the word ba'achad sharecha is an extra word. And we're going to dash the word achad, says Rabbi Yehuda, as if it was written in a different context with a different meaning. And it means bi'achad, meaning leave out the word sharecha, read it as if it says, Lo tuchal lizboch es pesach bi'achad. You cannot shech the korban pesach on behalf of one person. That's echad b'fnei atzmo. And Rabbi Yossi Omer Yochid, if you have one person that'll be able to eat the korban pesach, then fine, we'll shech the korban pesach on his behalf. I was going to ask how Rabbi Yossi deals with this extra word bi'echad. Asara, says Rabbi Yossi, ain't shochtin alam. And this we saw in the Mishnah there, it said 100, here it says 10, and it doesn't matter how many people are in the chabura, if they won't be able to eat the korban pesach, and there won't be a kazayas that's eaten, or a kazayas l'chalecha v'echad, depending on Rashi and the Rambam, then we don't shech the korban pesach. Rabbi Yossi, I v'echad my avidle. What does Rabbi Yossi do with the extra word v'echad? And as we said before, the simple meaning of the pasuk is that you want to shech the korban pesach somewhere on the face of the map. And miboile, therefore, Rabbi Yossi needs this word v'echad for the learning and the teaching of Lichid Rabbi Shimon. We learned in the Brisa Rabbi Shimon Omer, Minaylis Oveches Pischo, Bebamas Yochid B'Shas Isur Bamos, which means that when the people entered into Eretz Yisrael, they were allowed to set up each person as a private altar and shecht a korban on his own Bamas Yochid until they set up Shiloh. And then there was an Isur Bama later on, after the destruction of Shiloh. There was again a Heter Bamos. There was Nov. There was given until finally they got to Yerushalayim. They set up the Beis HaMikdash at the time of Shlomo Melech, and from then on, there would always be an Isur Hakrova B'Bamos. And now a person went ahead and he shechted the korban pesach in a Bamas Yachid during the period of time in which we are prohibited from bringing a korban on a Bamas Yachid. And the pasuk says, "Los tasun kechol asher anachnu otzim po hayom ish kol hayoshav b'einav." In Dvarim Yud Beis, we have a pasuk that prohibits shechting a korban of any sort, any zevach, in a bama during the time of Yisur Bamos, and kilo basam ad akal amucha velanachlo. This pasuk, which Moshe said to Klal Yisrael, that when they come to Eretz Yisrael, they will not be able to bring karbanos on bamos when we reach menucha and nachla, when there is a migdash. And during this time period, when there was a Migdash or a Mishkan, which has the status of a Migdash, he went ahead and he shechted the Korban Pesach. In a Babas Yachid, he violates the Yisur Lav, and he gets Malchus for this. Talmud Lomer, and this is derived from the Pasuk. Lo suchal lizbach es ha-pasach biachad charech, our Pasuk. Ki im, says the Pasuk, el ha-mokom asher yivchar Hashem, sham tizbach es ha-pasach. And we're going to derive from this that a person is makrim or Pesach outside of the Beis HaMikdash, he violates this losas, and that's called a bamas yachid b'shas iser bamos. Yachal, I might think, af b'shas heter bamos came. Maybe the Torah says that you violate this level of suchal lizbach as a Pesach. B'achad sharecha, even during a period of heter bamos. Talmud Lomer, the pasuk says, b'achad sharecha shelo amru el b'shah shekol Yisrael nichnasim b'shar echad. The pasuk prohibits a bamas yachid at a period of time when it's b'achad sharecha, when everybody in Israel goes through one shar, one city. They go into Yerushalayim and they bring the Korban Pesach on the Mizbeach and the Beis HaMikdash. That's a time of an Iser Bamos, and only during that period of time do you violate a lav of Lo Tuchal Lizboch Es HaPesach Chacharecha for shechting the Korban Pesach in a Bama. Now, during the time of Heter Bamos, we're not allowed to shecht a Korban Pesach on a Bamas Yachid, and the reason for that is because the heter of a bamas yachid only applies in the case of a Korban Nedava, not in the case of a Korban. Rabbi Yehuda, Hai Minole, from whence does Rabbi Yehuda, who uses the pasuk be echad, the extra word be'echad, he uses it to derive the conclusion that we don't bring the Korban Pesach, we don't check it on behalf of one individual. What does he do? How does he find the source for the Iser of the Iser Lotas, I should say, of shechting the Korban Pesach during the time period of Iser Bamos? And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Yehuda holds Tarte Shamet Mina. You can learn two derivations from one pasuk in this case. We can learn, number one, that the Pesach should not be shechted ala yachid for one individual, and also we derive the Iser of Shchitas HaPesach in a Bama during the time of Iser Bamos. So that word echad can be darshan both as far as Pesach al Yochid and as far as the Iser Bama. The Gemara now wants to understand why Rabbi Yossi rejects the drasha of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi mimai delahachi deka amar Rabbi Shimon. How does Rabbi Yossi know for sure that the pasuk here and the word echad is coming for the derivation of Rabbi Shimon, namely for the losaseh of shechting the Korban Pesach during the time period of Yisur Bamos? Dilma Kida Omar Rabbi Yehuda Hudeasa. Why not say that the extra word, the achad in the pasuk lo tizbach lo tuchal lizbach es haPesach biachad tarecha, is coming to teach us that the shechita should not be done on behalf of a yachid. Rabbi Yossi says that's not something they should even entertain in your mind. The Torah itself says in the parsha of Korban Pesach in Parshas Bo, ish lefiach lo tachusal aseh. Ish, implying one person is enough, and we will tachusa, we will shech the Korban Pesach on behalf of one individual. Rami le Rav Ukva bar Chinina mi Parshina. The Rava, so we have a question here that was asked by Rav Ukva to Rava. Mi Amar Rav Yehuda Chain Choftin Esa Pasach Al Hayachid Uriminu. I will quote to you another statement of Rabbi Yehuda that contradicts that statement. And in fact, you can shech the Korban Pesach for a yachid. The Brisa says, Isha berishon shochtin aleh b'fnei atzma. The Gemara understood at this point that we can shech the Korban Pesach on behalf of an Isha b'fnei atzma. She's obligated in the midst of Korban Pesach, and there's no one else in the Chabura. We're simply shechting it on her behalf. B'sheni, as far as Pesach Sheni is concerned, osin osa tfeila cheru. We will only bring a carbon Pesach Sheni on behalf of her together with others. She has to be mitzarefes with others when she's integrated with others as part of a chabur to be monui on the Pesach. We'll see exactly what the chabur is made of. And then we can bring the Pesach Sheni, but not on behalf of the Isha alone, Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Anyway, we see clearly Rabbi Yehuda holds that we check the Pesach for a Yochid. He says, Shokta the Pesach Rishon al Isha b'fnei atzma. So Rava responds to the question of Mar Ukva, Lo we shouldn't read it b'fnei atzma, ela ema b'fnei atzman. The word atzma in the singular has to be removed and replaced by atzman in the plural. So we're not going to shecht on behalf of one woman. We're going to shecht on behalf of a group of women, a minimum of 2 women. Amalei. So Rav Ukva comes back with another question to Rava, and he says, "Mi avdinit chabur shekula nashim." The way you're reading it now, there's such a thing as a chabur that consists only of women, and we'll check the Pesach on behalf of this chabur of women. Basnan, our Mishnah says, "Ein osim chaburas nashim avodim kanim." The Gemara understands that you don't bring the Korban Pesach neither for a chabur made up of women, exclusively of women, nor a chabur made up exclusively of avodim, nor a chabur that's made up exclusively of ketanim. I love nashim l'chudayu, avodim l'chudayu, ketanim l'chudayu. And here you see clearly that there's no such thing as gathering together a chabura that's made up of women and only of women. And now you're telling me that Rabbi Yehuda in this brisa was allowing a shchita of a korban pesach for nashim b'fnei atzman. It's a chabur of nashim. Amalei Rava said, no, you misunderstood the Mishnah. What the Mishnah was saying when it says ein osim chabur shel nashim v'avodim ktanim, what it meant was nashim v'avodim. There shouldn't be a combination in the chabura of both nashim and avodim, or for example, chabur of avodim and ktanim. In the case of a chabur of nashim avodim, we're not going to allow that mishum tiflus because we're afraid of some sort of a loose behavior in the area of modesty between an eved who lives a different kind of a lifestyle and a woman. Kind of avodim, even so, we're afraid mishum, and here we turn to daf Sadi Aleph on the base pitzusa. We're afraid of some homosexual act that could take place between the eved and the ketanim. And that's the reason why we won't allow this mixture of avodim and noshim, of avodim and ketanim. But as far as a chabura made up exclusively of noshim, the Mishnah never prohibited it. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda said we can bring a korban pesach and shecht it for noshim b'fnei atzman. He allowed you if there's more than one woman, but one woman, or for that matter, a combination of women and avodim and so forth, but one woman would not be permissible as far as the korban pesach is concerned, because as we saw Rabbi Yehuda derives from the pasuk b'echad that we don't shecht the korban on behalf of one person.